I've been saying for some time now that the synodal church will have a James Martin face. And I've been saying that because Francis keeps endorsing the things Pastor Jimmy Martin of the Jesuit Church does. I've been saying for some time that the American bishops, the state of the American bishops is such that Francis will take any opportunity he has to remake the bishops' conference into his own image. And there's a number of them that have retired or should be retiring this year. We saw that reflected in the consistory that's been announced, where the men who will choose the next pontiff, many of them are hitting that mandatory retirement age where they can't participate in a conclave anymore because canon law requires there to be at least a certain number of bishops for that process. He has to make new cardinals. And then he announced a whole bunch of cardinals who turns out that when people start digging into them are sympathetic to James Martin's cause. And then it happened that last week, it was reported that Cardinal McElroy, Cardinal Supich, and Cardinal Joseph Tobin met with Pope Francis privately. It wasn't on his schedule, but they formally announced it to the media and even showed some pictures. But they didn't say what they were talking about, other than issues pertaining to the American church. Francis has been overtly hostile to the American church for years. I've made endless videos about him taking cheap shots at the American church. And it was pretty obvious of what they were talking about. There's a number of bishops retiring in the American church. And those three men are the voice of Francis in the United States. They are his closest allies. With a number of bishops and archbishops retiring, they almost certainly were giving him feedback on who they thought would be a good fit or what would be a good markers for men to be in the American episcopate so that they could then guide the church in a synodal Francis direction. And here is now your proof that the synodal church, the ape of the church, will have a James Martin face. From the Catholic Herald, you get this, and I have to be pretty careful when talking about this on this platform, but a headline from the Catholic Herald. Pope meets with people who refuse concrete nature of reality, who are Catholic activists, and who claim he discussed appointing more open U.S. bishops. Ah, yes, more open U.S. bishops. Meaning ones who do not defend common sense, who do not defend basic reality. That wasn't controversial just a few short years ago, and men who will not witness to basic truth in the public realm, who will preach a materialist gospel of all are welcome here. No need to leave your sin at the door. We're just going to dialogue and listen. That's what they're talking about here. I'll bet you that James Martin was thrilled with this when he heard about this. The U.S. bishops have been the subject of his ire for quite a long time, given the numerous attacks he's leveled against them for doing things like trying to give something that passes for Catholicism to the laity, for saying even lukewarm things against public unrepentant sinners who are Catholic and politicians, or for even doing the right thing by, showing up when nuns are being mocked outside of a baseball stadium and praying with the common man who are there, who understand, who have a greater sense of the faith than many bishops do, and joining them in a public response to this stuff. If you notice that news that the candidate with the horrifyingly bad laugh, multiple film from multiple angles has come from a rally that person held where someone yelled, "Christ is Lord," and their response was, "You're in the wrong place." Multiple angles where you can clearly hear both parties speaking. To my knowledge, no bishop has spoken up about that yet. Why do you think that is? I want you to think about that for a while, because this is directly related to it. They are now under great pressure to not rock the boat. Francis doesn't want them involved in politics in any way. Even when our Lord being mocked in that way should be something that any bishop should respond to, even if it's just a sort of a lukewarm way. That would be better than silence. The story is a confirmation of the story that I covered about Supich, McElroy, and Tobin meeting with Francis. And the details were being hidden, but the meeting made public because they weren't trying to be subtle. There was no subtlety there. They weren't even aiming for subtlety. The article is very short, so let's go over it again with some diligence, given the nature of the place we're talking about this. Quote, Pope Francis met with a group of American confused Catholics on the 12th of October to discuss the situation of and challenges faced by the James Martin crowd in the church. While it was a private meeting and not an official engagement, of most interest to other Catholics is likely to be the claim that during the Pope, who reportedly broached the issue of appointing bishops in the United States who are more welcoming to such Catholics. The Pope allegedly made the comment on Saturday at his private residence during the 80-minute meeting with 11 Catholics who are one flavor or another of generally confused or supporters of those groups, reports The Times. The meeting was arranged by New Ways Ministry, a US-based group championing such Catholics. As an aside, that group was founded by a nun who for 50 years had been told off by the US bishops, and now she's pen pals with Pope Francis, as I reported to you earlier in the summer and last year. It should be noted that the headline chosen by the Times of Pope Francis is open to appointing such friendly bishops appears a bit of a stretch to say the least, based on what his reporting has been said and to have occurred. The meeting can just as easily be read as Pope doing his best to be sympathetic and listening to the experiences of some of his flock. Why would you think that? I don't know why Catholic Herald is going to these lengths to defend him. Raymond DeVere, a retired Catholic deacon with a daughter who was confused, said, Francis mentioned that the situation experienced by such people will be more on his mind. He said that when he appoints new bishops in the U.S., he will consider their openness to such people as a criteria. I think he was actually talking about his son, by the way. A second participant confirmed they had heard the Pope's remarks about U.S. bishops, according to the Times. It noted that the Vatican's press office declined to comment on the content of the meeting, saying the encounter had been of a private nature, and adds the press office did not respond to subsequent requests for confirmation of the comments specifically relating to U.S. bishops. Sister Janine Gramick, an American nun, co-founded New Ways Ministry nearly 50 years ago. She reportedly wanted to arrange the meeting after reading Dignitas Infinita, the doctrinal paper published by the Vatican in April on the importance of human dignity. It condemns a variety of violations of human dignity, including the ideology of the flesh behind this nonsense, and the professional practices around it. And it goes on and on and on, talking about how these bishops in the future need to have empathy and to be open-minded to this stuff. I don't know why they don't believe New Ways Ministry on this. People didn't believe it when Sister Janine Gramick and Pastor Jimmy Martin of the Jesuit Church, her very close friend, both claimed to have had private meetings with Francis and received private correspondence. People didn't believe it. And then they published his handwritten letters online, like pictures of them, and it was obvious that it was his, because the signature is very well known. So that's what they're going to do to the American episcopate. They're going to give it a James Martin face, just like the synodal church. And all this brings to mind the so-called Francis effect. It has been noted that Francis hasn't exactly been good for vocations, and that under his watch, the apostasy of the faithful in Europe has dramatically accelerated, and that divisions in the church under his watch have grown much worse than before. That's on top of and as a consequence of his preaching heresy, because he does preach heresy. It's been well documented. The synodal church will demand the silence of those of us who oppose these things. And I will prove that to you in tomorrow's live stream. But for now, you see the manifestation of his errors on this and so many other topics in a very remarkable place. Headline from Marco Tosati, Seminarians and the Francis Effect. Steady decline for 11 years in a row, according to Catholic World News. And it's super short. It just gives you the statistics, and I appreciate that, because that's the only part that matters here. But the concrete effect has been he has not inspired new vocations. You're going to see a drop-off here that doesn't look remarkable until you factor in something important, and that's the retirement of bishops and retirements of priests. And I will talk to you in a moment about the retirement of priests. And when you see this, you understand that this is not good news in the slightest. So here's the quote from his article. The number of major seminarians in the world dropped from 109,895 at the end of 2021 to 108,481 at the end of 2022, according to statistics published by Fides News Agency. Between the end of 2020 and the end of 2021, the number of seminarians worldwide had decreased from 111,855 to 109,895. The number of major seminarians worldwide increased from 63,882 in 1978 to 110,553 in 2000, far outpacing the growth rate of the world population, and increased more steadily over the next decade to a peak of 120,616 in 2011. The decline was particularly pronounced starting in 2019. The number of seminarians stood at 114,058 at the end of 2019. The decline in seminarians in 2022 was more pronounced in the Americas and Europe. In Africa, however, the number of seminarians increased by 726 units in 2022, and in Oceania by 12 units. End quote. And there's a number of factors to that, all of which Francis does nothing to oppose. In that same time period, the world is getting the Western, the former Christendom countries, we'll lump the US in there with them, were becoming increasingly secular, increasingly atheistic, as a partially as a response to the McCarrick problems in the Catholic Church and similar problems among Protestants, and a lot of in the sudden rise in rock and roll lukewarm Protestantism in their worship centers, where it's like just going to a concert and then listening to a guy give you his opinion about the Bible. As that stuff all increased, and bad news about the church in general came into the public eye, as well as the acceptance of general impurity and things growing in the culture, you've seen these things happen. It's all a cascading effect. And that one of the jobs of the Pope should be doing at those times is to stand firm against that, speak eloquently and simply, and preach the truth. But unfortunately, the gospel he preaches is a false gospel. And that's where we are now. And all of those things, plus his terrible leadership, has led to this dramatic decline in seminarians. So what he's asking for now, of course, to fix all this is more open bishops who will oversee fewer seminarians and fewer priests. This is on top of the expected retirement of huge numbers of diocesan priests in coming years. A couple of years ago, The Pillar had an article on this that I won't go over the whole thing because it's super long, but we'll talk about the relevant section here. There is a enormous number of priests in the process of retiring. These are the first generation post-conciliar priests. These are the ones who were ordained after Vatican II, in many cases, and they are retiring in large numbers. These are the ones who were probably in our time, the ones that you encounter who are the biggest cheerleaders of Francis, of the secularization of the faith, as that priest whose really long letters I read to you from time to time talks about the de-Christianization of the church. All of those things. They're the biggest champions of it. They're the ones, if you struggle with any kind of habitual sin, who you go to confession, and instead of being given a stern talking to, or even a pastoral, sympathetic talking to, and then absolution, it's usually the other person on the side of the screen who's telling you, it's not that big of a deal. The church says not that much of a sin if it's a habit. Just say an act of contrition next time you're at Mass and go receive communion. It's that guy who's retiring, okay? Not sad to see those kinds of priests go, but this is important to understand where we're headed and where Francis is taking things when he remakes the church in a James Martin face. The headline from them is America's Retiring Priests, and the short relevant section is this, quote, with more than 1/3 of priests in the United States already retired, priest retirements are expected to outpace ordinations in most U.S. dioceses for several years to come. While the number of retired priests mirrors the trend of retiring baby boomers across the American workforce, clergy retirements represent a significant challenge in the church, financially and in terms of the distribution and allocation of resources. There were 24,653 diocesan Catholic priests in the United States in 2020, according to data compiled by CARA, the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate. More than 1/3 of those priests was retired, and the share of American priests who are retired has more than doubled since 1980. In 9 American dioceses, more than 50% of diocesan priests are retired. Let's pause here and take a look at these charts here. Percentage of U.S. diocesan priests who are retired. In 1980, 14%. 1990, 19%. 2000, 27%. 2010, 32%. 2020, 34%. Now, it does look like, it increased by 5% from 1980 to 1990, and then 8% by 2000, and it slowed down a little bit to 5%, and now it's 2% by 2020. Maybe by 2030, it'll stay at 34%, or it might get really big. Who knows? It's not surprising for any segment of the US population to see a changing ratio of retirees to workers. In 1965, there were 4 US workers paying into Social Security for every person receiving benefits, while today there are only 2.7 workers for every retiree, according to the data from the Social Security Administration. But the change has been much more dramatic among priests. In 1965, there were 21.2 active diocesan priests for everyone who was retired. Today, there are only 1.9. So when you talk about the Francis effect, that's a key indicator. You're not getting the priest to retire, or you're not getting new seminarians to come in and replace the priests who are already grossly outnumbered by the retirees, or we're getting to that point where they're not at the healthy ratio for the church anymore. And now he's going to be appointing the bishops who will be trying to fix that problem. See how this can happen. One of the indicators for why Francis would do such a thing is very, very simple. In the diocesan system right now, it is known and spoken about, whispered about, that young seminarians are increasingly conservative and traditionally minded. These are the kind of men who, once given the opportunity to offer the traditional mass, many of them will do so, once the situation in Rome changes and they're allowed to do so again. This is even true of religious orders, including the Jesuits. I guarantee you, Cardinal Cupich, Cardinal McElroy, and Cardinal Tobin, who met with Pope Francis, know this, that they are trying to do something to correct this problem. Because if they don't correct it, they will have a gigantic problem on their hands. Even though those men will be retired or gone to their judgment by the time they have to deal with it. Because Cardinal Cupich hit mandatory retirement age at 75 this year. Francis did not accept his resignation letter, and so he is still in the Archdiocese of Chicago. But for how long? And I suspect Cardinal McElroy will be the one moved there to keep that diocese under the safe hands for the modernists of Cardinal McElroy. I'm going to check here the live chat before we wrap this up. This is an important story to keep a diligent eye on, that I cannot emphasize enough, that this is not a story that people should ignore. And the synod is happening, making so a lot of stories that should be talked about aren't getting talked about, and bringing those to you this week. So let's take a look here. Let's see. Maribel says, pray to God that Francis cannot carry out these sinister plans to empower the James Martin bishops or supporting their cause. We already know how many I tend to think you're right. That this is why you pray for vocations, and pray and fast and keep the rogation days, and you keep keep all the fasting days related to that were done away with at Vatican II, by the way, and then vocations disappeared. It's amazing. One of the things that happened with the new liturgical calendar, which was necessary if you're going to invent a new mass, is that most of the traditional fasting seasons were gone. There was discussion of getting rid of Lent, but that thankfully didn't happen. But Advent used to be a time of joyful fasting. You were fasting in preparation for the birth of our Lord. So there were celebrations still, right? It's not wrong if you want to decorate your house for Christmas early, but it was a fasting season as well as a joyful season. It's not a fasting season anymore. Nobody talks about it that way except trads. That's it. The rogation days are gone. The ember days, those things are only still around because people keep bringing them up and trying to bring them back. And they were all tied to vocations in some way or another. And once they were done away with, vocations collapsed. I do not think that's a coincidence. If you have a spiritual framework of the nature of reality, you'll understand the importance of fasting. WM says the SSPX bishops are dropping like flies. I think they're trying to run out the clock on Francis. Word is that they've got permission from Francis to consecrate new bishops. I think they're just discussing who it will be. But again, wait until to talk about that in any serious way until the SSPX leadership says something themselves, because number of times over the last 3 or 4 years, priests have gone to their ambos at Sunday Mass and said, "Oh, we're about to consecrate new bishops," and then nothing happens, or that the SSPX have to say, "No, we're not doing it yet." All right. All right, thanks very much for tuning in. How many seminarians are dropping out? That's the one thing that article never addresses, actually, and that's a good point. Seminaries have a high attrition rate, and they should have a high attrition rate. Going to seminary should be rigorous. It should be the spiritual equivalent of Marine Corps boot camp. That's what it should be. And some places are like that. And so a lot of men don't make it through. Now, a lot of men don't make it through either because their seminaries are run by James Martin types who do not want Orthodox priests. So they stop them. Number of horror stories out there about that as well. All right, folks, thanks very much for tuning in today. And as always, pray for the church and pray for vocations, please. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.